This episode of the HoopsHype Podcast is brought to you by the Big Three. Ice Cube's Big Three is back for Season 2. For those of you who don't know, the Big Three is a professional 3-on-3 basketball league featuring former NBA stars like Amari Stoudemire, Nate Robinson, Chauncey Billups, Baron Davis, Carlos Boozer, Mike Bibby, Meta World Peace, and many, many more. The list goes on and on. Get your tickets for games at big3.com/tickets. That's big3.com/tickets, or tune in live every Friday night on Fox or FS1. That's right, this year the games are going to be on live, not tape delay. Big Three, we're changing the game. Welcome to another episode of the HoopsHype Podcast. My name is Alex Kennedy, and joining me today is Michael Scotto from The Athletic. You can follow him on Twitter at Mike A. Scotto. How you doing, Mike?
Hey, what's up, AK? I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing well, man. I'm excited for free agency, excited for hopefully a lot of fun moves and a lot of fun transactions. That's why I have you on today. It's a rumor roundup podcast. We were doing them around the trade deadline. Now we want to bring them back now that we're having a lot of free agency rumors to discuss. But let's start with some trades, because there were some trade rumors around the NBA draft, and now as free agency approaches, we're continuing to hear some trade buzz. Let's start with Kawhi Leonard, because that's kind of the topic that everyone's following recently. Sam Amick of USA Today Sports reported that Kawhi will either be on the Spurs when the season starts or traded to an Eastern Conference team. It seems like they have no desire to keep him in the Western Conference. What's the latest that you're hearing with Kawhi, and what do you expect to happen with the situation?
Well, I think looking long-term over the summer and towards the season, I agree with Sam's assessment. I'd be shocked if, at one point there was some rumblings about maybe Kawhi joining the Lakers with LeBron and Paul George if they could facilitate a trade. I don't necessarily see that, and I don't see San Antonio trying to help build another super team. We already have one in the Western Conference with Golden State. As far as the Eastern Conference, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that the Philadelphia 76ers are certainly a team that's in the mix that would have the most assets to acquire him. And even at the draft, we saw that they acquired more assets in getting Zaire Smith and a future unprotected first-round pick. So they continue to add to the treasure chest. They have Dario Saric, they have Markelle Fultz, Robert Covington. They have a ton of young guys outside of Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid that they can use in trade talks to help facilitate something for Kawhi. Philly would love to improve on the wing, and whether that's, maybe making a free agent run at LeBron or even Paul George trying to trade for Kawhi. Those are the type of things you could see from Philly. I think they believe that they're close to taking the next step, and if they can add another elite player, whomever it may be, they'll have a real chance next season when they're going up against, in my opinion, the Boston Celtics for the Eastern Conference crown if LeBron James ultimately does leave Cleveland.
Yeah, I agree with you. Now, I want to ask you something. You reported this before the draft, basically that Philadelphia was looking to package Markelle Fultz and their 2 first-round picks for a top 5 selection. You had reported that they were looking at Michael Porter Jr. Now, obviously, this was earlier on in the draft process, and then whenever Porter's back wasn't, he had the back issue and the hip issue. Whenever that was, a concern, they backed off. But are the Sixers open to trading Markelle Fultz for the right piece?
Yeah, and I mean, the thing with Philadelphia is that, like I said, they had internal discussions about packaging 10, 26 and Fultz if they can move up into the top 5. And at the time, Porter was the target. Now, that thinking dampened when his back remained a major question mark, And, the other thing, here's the thing I'll say about Philadelphia. They're not just going to trade Markelle Fultz and give him away. Let's be clear. But there are a few players in the league that a team would not listen to a trade conversation on. Fultz has certainly had his struggles shooting the ball, but it's good to see him working with Drew Hamlin, a well-respected trainer and a guy who has helped other players improve. I think he'll do the same thing with Markelle. He's still an excellent talent and quite an athlete. On the flip side, for Philadelphia, if J.J. Redick leaves in free agency for whatever reason, you could see Fultz starting at shooting guard as well. And Philadelphia can stagger lineups between Simmons, Fultz, and Embiid. All three. Embiid can shoot 3-pointers, yes, but I wouldn't say that those three combined are an elite shooting group by any stretch. So they would, stagger those lineups and whatnot to try to make it effective, as we've seen with Brett Brown. But, to answer your question, yeah, I would say that if a team called Philly and asked about Fultz, they would listen. But as you mentioned, it's got to be for the right package. They're not just going to give away the former number one pick in the draft.
Yeah, I think the same can be said for the Boston Celtics, possibly, that, they have all these assets too, from draft picks to their young players like Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown. They have a lot of interesting pieces. Terry Rozier. Could you see the Celtics making a move for Kawhi Leonard potentially, or obviously Anthony Davis has been thrown out there, but I don't think the Pelicans are anywhere close to that yet. Is there another player they could target without giving up those big pieces?
I think if you're Boston, you're going to try to get rid of Jaylen Brown, if anyone, out of that group, just because they're so high on Tatum at this point. So, you have to give to get, and they certainly still have other draft picks. Don't have Brooklyn's picks anymore, believe it or not, but they certainly have still a treasure chest of draft picks. And even coming out of this draft, they come out with Robert Williams in the first round, and regardless of what's gone on so far off the court, he's still a talent on it, and you could also package him in a trade. When you look at Boston and Philadelphia, they have the most assets to go out and get a star via the trade market in the East, in my opinion, if they choose to do so.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what happens with Kawhi Leonard. I could see the Spurs holding on to him and starting the season with him, seeing if you could salvage the relationship, if this is mainly his camp being in his ear and that's why he's doing some of these things and making some of these decisions. Is that a possibility that we could see Kawhi end up staying in San Antonio long term? If they're, based on what you've heard from their meetings with him, from the, the rumors, the intel that's been coming out of, Kawhi's camp, do you think there's any chance of him staying in San Antonio, or is that no longer a possibility?
I mean, I guess ultimately anything's a possibility, but, based on the way Tony Parker's comments have kind of rubbed him, and, figuring that he also has to, be healthy to get his payday down the road. We saw what's happened with Isaiah Thomas after he left Boston, and how he was in Cleveland and LA. I think that has to factor into his thinking a little bit. How much is Kawhi's uncle in his ear? And the other X factor, I think, that not a lot of people are talking about when you look at the San Antonio Spurs next year, is that Tony Parker's a free agent, and, there's always the chance that Manu Ginobili could retire. If Tony Parker leaves San Antonio, does Kawhi change his thinking maybe and looks to maybe reconcile with San Antonio, or is his heart ultimately set on going somewhere else, such as the Lakers? Only Kawhi really knows the answer to that question.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, like you said, that Tony Parker can leave. I think the question is, does he think that Tony Parker, was saying something, was basically an extension of Greg Popovich there? Because we know the Spurs don't really talk to the media a whole lot and say a whole lot of things like that. Was that something that he was told to do, or was that something that, he had heard from others in the organization? And getting past a trust issue with the medical side of things, that can be really difficult too, where you feel like they don't have your best interest in mind. I can understand the frustration there. I want to ask you about, any other teams do you think are active in trade talks right now? We mentioned Philly, we mentioned Boston. They have a ton of assets, obviously. Are there any other teams that are looking to pull off a big trade, or any other guys that you think are available that we should pay attention to while everyone kind of shifts their focus to free agency? Are there any big trades that could happen that may surprise people?
What I would say is when I look at the trade market and the landscape, I think you have to look at some guys maybe that aren't big names, but are still guys that could be on the move. For example, with the Clippers, I think Pat Beverly is a guy who could potentially be on the move this summer. He's certainly been mentioned in trade talks over his career. And, it really depends on where the Clippers view themselves. Also with the Hawks, there's always the possibility that they try to trade Dennis Schrader and Kent Bazemore as they continue to rebuild and try to go young and make even more cap space for potential moves down the road. With the Orlando Magic, I look at Nikola Vucevic, your guy close to home for you. Just because of the selection of Mo Bamba, they have to figure out what they're doing with Aaron Gordon in restricted free agency. You drafted Jonathan Isaac last year. At some point, I think Vooch could eventually be the odd man out, especially with Bamba now coming into the fold. I really can't see a way where all four of those guys could coexist effectively. Other than that, another big man you could see on the move, Marcin Gortat, who's in the final year of his contract with the Washington Wizards. With the Brooklyn Nets, I would look at possibly Spencer Dinwiddie in the final year of his deal. Brooklyn is always active and looking on the trade market to acquire assets, whether it's a player or draft picks down the road. And other than that, another domino for a big guy. If LeBron leaves, I certainly could see Cleveland exploring Kevin Love's value on the trade market at that point. If LeBron leaves, I would expect Cleveland to go into somewhat of a rebuilding mode in a sense. And I think that based on Kevin Love's age and, his remaining contract, that it would behoove Cleveland to look at the market for him as well. When you look at the Toronto Raptors, for example, there's, been some discussion about will they keep the core together in the backcourt of Kyle Lowry and DeMar DeRozan. If I had to pick out of those two, I would say DeMar would stay as they look to, try to improve the team. But Kyle Lowry could certainly be on the move. It's early in the process, but these are certainly possibilities of guys, that I would think. And then, for example, if the Lakers get, say theoretically the Lakers get LeBron James and they get Paul George, or they get two type of stars, could they try to make a trade for a third one involving a Brandon Ingram, for example, a Kyle Kuzma? These are things that you have to look at, as free agency unfolds. So those are just some of the type of things that I'm keeping an eye on as we get towards July.
Now let's talk about free agency. When you look at this class, there's a lot of stars at the top, but I think some of them are going to go back to their original team. Kevin Durant going back to Golden State, Chris Paul going back to Houston. Those things seem like certainties. How strong is this class when you look at it as a whole, and how deep is it too?
I think the class is pretty good. You still have some X factors on the board, such as DeAndre Jordan with his player option and whatnot. With Paul George, I still think you have to really look at the Lakers for him. In years past, we've seen speculation, for example, like Gordon Hayward eventually going to the Celtics, and it turned out to be true. And we saw that speculation out there as early as a year before. We've certainly heard the Paul George rumblings to the Lakers for a while. So I think that that's certainly something you have to look at. LeBron's going to obviously be the biggest domino. With Chris Paul in Houston, personally, I would like to see CP3 back in Houston and have that team bring pretty much everyone back if they can. They gave Golden State a great run for their money in the Western Conference playoffs this year. And, you can make an argument that if Chris Paul doesn't get hurt, maybe they beat the Golden State Warriors and they're in the finals instead. Another name to certainly keep an eye on, DeMarcus Cousins. With Dallas getting Luka Doncic and not taking a guy like Mohamed Bamba, you have to certainly look at the Dallas Mavericks as a team that's going to be in the hunt for DeMarcus. Obviously, the New Orleans Pelicans as well, as they try to retain him. But Dallas has certainly been a team that has looked at free agent centers in the past. Sure, there's the chance that DeAndre Jordan, comes out and, could they make a run at him? I guess, but I don't know. That's like kind of going after the girl that rejected you once. You're really going to try to swing for it again. Clint Capella will. Clint Capella
I feel like. Hold on, really quick. I feel like Mark Cuban wants to go offer DeAndre Jordan a contract just so he can pull it at the last second and say, "Nope, that's not happening." He wants to get his revenge.
It'd be funny if he did that, kind of like on Shark Tank when he looks at the contestant and he goes, "I'm out."
Yeah, exactly. He's gonna give him the "I'm out" after giving him the contract.
That'd be really funny. But yeah, and like even Clint Capella, Houston will have the right to retain him. So realistically, if Dallas is going to make a big splash, as they try to kind of give Dirk a fun season and a chance where he can compete at least in some regard. Getting Luka Doncic, I thought was a great trade. They got a future franchise star in him, in my opinion. And, getting Cousins, I think, is certainly going to be at the forefront of their thinking regarding free agency. They've always tried. I'll say this. In my opinion, they have not filled Tyson Chandler's void at center ever since he left. And I think that they view DeMarcus Cousins as a really talented player who could fill that void long term. And then the other thing about Dallas is, they've been linked to everybody from other reports. You see Julius Randle get linked to them as well as a center. So Dallas is certainly going to be active on the free agent market in that regard. And then there's some other guys in restricted free agency I'm very intrigued by. A couple of BDA clients, Aaron Gordon and Zach LaVine, will be very interesting to see what happens with them. And, both the young talents that can certainly draw a high price on the free agent market.
Now, one thing that's interesting to me is that there aren't a ton of teams that have significant cap space this summer. I believe it's only 7 or 8 teams that have a max spot. How is that going to impact some of these restricted free agency deals? And guys that may deserve more money could end up signing for significantly less, and that could actually make them available to some of these other teams that don't have max space. If some of these teams go out and sign other players, then there's going to be a number of players left that I think get less than people are expecting, just based off of the last 2 years, especially 2016. That summer was insane. I think there's people this summer that could get underpaid based on what fans think they deserve. Is that accurate in your assessment?
Yeah, Alex, I think that looking at this draft, at this free agency, it's certainly a drier market than we've seen in the past when guys like Kent Bazemore, Timothy Mozgov, Joakim Noah, Luol Deng were all getting paid substantially well. When I look at this class for free agency going into the summer, I think that what you may see are shorter deals, and especially one-year deals for some guys as they try to get into the market the following summer when the market should on paper reset itself a little bit and there'll be more teams with cap space. And I think that, to me, that's the thing to look at. At the end of the day, the big guys are going to get paid. LeBron, Paul George, Chris Paul, even DeMarcus Cousins, despite coming off a major injury, I do expect them to get paid. The wild cards are going to be what happens with Aaron Gordon and Zach LaVine in the restricted free agent market. Julius Randle's free agency is going to be interesting. Jabari Parker. I'm trying to think who else. You could say Derek Favors as well. Just guys that, as you mentioned, are kind of going to be sort of tough to peg because there are only a limited number of teams with salary space for even a max guy. And those teams that have that space that may not use it towards one max guy, how are you going to filter that between maybe 2 free agents or possibly even 3? I think certainly you're going to have to look at teams who have the mid-level exception, the non-taxpayer exception, and maybe guys will target that instead more so than they have in the past. This is all a product of the drier market that everyone is facing going into this summer.
Yeah, that's one thing that my colleague Frank Urbina predicted a while ago, that we could see a lot of players on those mid-level exception type deals and guys that you necessarily wouldn't think of as an MLE type player, which could open up the market to a lot of other teams that we're not thinking of, because if the mid-level exception is out there, then it's going to come down to playing time, the possibility of winning, the market. So that could actually open things up for, quite a bit of teams. So that'll be interesting to see. Now let's talk about some of these top free agents. You mentioned DeMarcus Cousins. How much do you think his injury will hurt him? And if the Pelicans don't re-sign him, how badly will that hurt the relationship with Anthony Davis potentially? Because he's become close to Boogie. He wants him back. I think it's the first time they've been able to put a real star, player next to him, a perennial all-star. Do you think that would really do some damage to that relationship potentially?
Well, regarding DeMarcus Cousins, I certainly think that, and I'll say this is the same for also DeAndre Jordan and even Clint Capella as well. When Phoenix took DeAndre number 1, you lost another potential free agent suitor who was looking at a center before the draft.
Yeah.
Now that we're after the draft, to me, I look at Cousins with the Pelicans in Dallas. Sure, you can mention the Lakers as maybe a fallback option, but the Lakers are targeting obviously some bigger fish, with all due respect to DeMarcus. I think Dallas is the team to really watch for with DeMarcus. And even, in the last mock draft I had mentioned that they believe they have a strong chance to land him in free agency. And, even more so if they passed on Mohamed Bamba, which they did, it would signal the team would try to go all in on trying to get a guy like DeMarcus Cousins or someone of that caliber at the center position. So when you look at the Pelicans specifically, and you mentioned about Anthony Davis aside, if you're the Pelicans, you don't want to lose a guy like Cousins at his talent when you can always try to flip him down the road as a trade asset. And, they're not going to be able to attract a free agent per se with the way their salary cap situation is. Equally with that said, with New Orleans, bringing back Rajon Rondo, I think is also something that not a lot of people are talking about as heavily. But I think that bringing back Rondo is equally important to the success of that team. He had a great effect on Anthony Davis. They almost had their version of Lob City with the two of them, and there's something to be said for having playoff Rondo for a team like New Orleans. You saw Drew Holiday move off the ball a little bit more and become more of a scorer. So when I kind of put all of that in the pot and I stir it up, I'm looking for New Orleans to pony up and try to bring back Cousins, because you really can't replace him. Yeah. Ultimately, you don't have the flexibility to do it. So you're kind of leveraged in a sense where you have to, put your best foot forward to bring him back. And if you don't, you lose pretty much a tremendous asset for nothing, despite coming off the injury. So the last thing I would say about that is, with your other question, is the injury going to hurt him? It'll give maybe a little pause or concern, but ultimately I still think he's going to get paid just based on the leverage of the situation at hand.
Yeah, the fact that Dallas didn't draft a center, and Rick Carlisle even said, we have free agency. We're going to be able to address that need in free agency. And I do think they're going to make a run at DeMarcus. That's huge for him, because it does give him that second team. So he's not, the Pelicans aren't bidding against themselves. He's going to be able to, have a market and have another team he could potentially flee to. So I think that was big for him. And we'll see if he chooses Dallas or New Orleans. If the Pelicans can't re-sign him, they don't really have much room to make any kind of moves or make any kind of improvements. So that's going to be really difficult for them. And I could see that leading to Anthony Davis being upset. And then from there, obviously, we've heard teams like Boston and Philly, and these teams are interested in Davis, and obviously they would be because he's so special. I think that could be really bad for the Pelicans. Now, I want to ask you about two guys that we touched on briefly. Let's start with Paul George. Do you think he will go to the Lakers, or will he stay with the Thunder? And is there any other team that has a shot at him? I mean, Philadelphia has the second most cap space in the league, but it seems like we're just hearing Lakers and Thunder. Is there any other team in the mix here?
When I look at Paul George's situation, I think you really have to look at the Los Angeles Lakers, especially based on his roots. Other than that, Philadelphia, I think, would be really intriguing. Because they could certainly use a guy, as I mentioned earlier, on the wing who can be a difference maker. With that said, though, I don't know if they're going to use Philly more as leverage or if it's substance. Certainly you do have the Thunder, but Carmelo's going to be in the last year of his deal at that point. Russell Westbrook is obviously entrenched as the franchise guy. It really depends on what PG wants. If he wants to go closer to home, if he believes that Russell Westbrook and he can form a tandem as a long-term core that can sustain success in Oklahoma City. Personally, I'm not sure. You saw what happened last year with Carmelo Anthony in the fold and all those guys. Didn't necessarily pan out the way that they had all hoped. So you had that experience already. Now do you look for greener pastures possibly in LA? I could see it.
Now, we'll get to LeBron James in 1 second, but I do want to ask you this. If LeBron goes to Los Angeles, does that help their chances of getting Paul George, or does that hurt their chance of getting Paul George? Do you think he wants to go there and be the main guy, or would he want to go there to team up with LeBron, in your opinion?
I think any player in the league would love to play with LeBron James because of the way he plays the game. He's a star player that makes his teammates better, and he's clearly a willing facilitator. So from that perspective, yeah, maybe in an ideal world, any guy who's a free agent that goes elsewhere wants to be the guy, but you really can't complain when you get LeBron. And the other thing I'll say about LeBron's free agency, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what player not named LeBron James, because I don't think LeBron is making a decision at 12:01 July 1, who takes advantage of the other teams with cap space and agrees to a deal first. Because as we mentioned, there's going to be a drier salary cap this year. You may see I don't want to say an average guy, but somebody maybe outside the box. Like if you remember a couple of years ago, Timothy Mozgov was the first guy to agree to a deal. Now I don't know who would have necessarily foreseen that, but that is kind of what I'm looking at for this free agency class. Who's going to be that guy at 12:01 that kind of agrees to something that's maybe a little bit outside the box?
Yeah.
But yeah, regarding Paul George, I certainly think he or any other player in the league would and should want to play with LeBron James because he's a willing facilitator.
Yeah, I think the fact that Paul George is 5 years younger helps too. He just turned 28 years old. You could go to Los Angeles and team up with LeBron James, and then eventually it could become your team. You still could, be the man eventually. You can kind of get the best of both worlds there. And you make a good point. 2 years ago it was Timothy Mozgov. 2 or 3 years ago, I think it was Tony Snell last year. That was the first guy that signed. With this summer, with so few teams having cap space, there's a number of agents and players that are going to jump at that and try to be that first guy to ink a deal before the cap space is gone. That makes a lot of sense. That'll be interesting. We could see more deals done on July 1st than usual, or at least earlier in free agency, teams agreeing to terms, just because there's not a whole lot of options out there. It's not like, guys are weighing 6, 7, 8 options. It could be, that this actually expedites the process a little bit. Now, let's focus on LeBron James. We talked about him a little bit. I know Vegas right now has the Lakers or returning to the Cavaliers as 1 and 2 options. I'm not sure about that. I have a hard time believing he's going to go back to the Cavaliers, and I don't think the Lakers are the only team he's going to consider. When you look at LeBron James' free agency, what do you see happening?
Well, I think maybe not as prevalent in the forefront would be the Philadelphia 76ers. I'm a little surprised to see I don't know if I want to call it speculation or rumblings, whichever word you want to use, but let's talk about Philadelphia as a viable option. I think that, that would be a really interesting fit.
Yeah.
As you look long term. And yeah, certainly you have the Lakers and Cleveland. I'll say this when I look at LeBron's free agency. Cleveland has probably the least amount of flexibility to bring in reinforcements. You know exactly what you're getting. And in the playoffs, LeBron carried this team on his back. They nearly lost to the Pacers in round one, which I don't think a lot of people talk about, after they ended up going to the finals. But LeBron had so many big moments against Indiana, the shot against Toronto at the buzzer, going up against Boston. He carried that team single-handedly. As he continues to advance in age, I know so far he's defeated Father Time, but at some point he's going to want more help. And I don't know if he looks at that core and says that he has the adequate help to get there, especially after this past season. When you look at, Philadelphia, you've got two young guys in Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons who both have had, injuries in the past, which you have to consider, but their legs are young, and you have a longer term couple of building blocks there with them. And then with the Lakers, I mean, they've been slowly building towards this free agent recruitment for a long time and getting young guys like Lonzo, Brandon Ingram, Kyle Kuzma. They have young assets that you can either have with LeBron or they can package those guys and try to get another star. So really for LeBron, I think to me, those were the three teams that I looked at, as potential fits for him.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You look at LeBron, and I agree that Philly makes a ton of sense. Ben Simmons is also with Rich Paul, who is LeBron's agent, so there's a connection there. I'm surprised it not being mentioned more because I do think it's a great fit, and it does fit LeBron's MO, where he goes to these younger teams that have a wide open championship window. When he went to Miami the first time, people were expecting them to be a contender for 6, 7, 8 years, as they made it very clear to us in that pep rally. When he goes back to Cleveland, Dwayne Wade was older, Chris Bosh was, had some injuries, and wasn't the same player. He goes back to Cleveland to play with Kyrie Irving. When he went back, they had Andrew Wiggins, and they made the trade for Kevin Love. He goes to these teams that are younger and have a wide open window, so Philly does fit that. Now, maybe he looks at them and says they're too young, and maybe he, feels like the age gap is too big, but I don't think that's the case. This is a team that, if he joins them, I think they're in the finals, or, at the very least, a 7-game series with Boston, for sure. I think it would be a lot of fun.
To me, the biggest thing when I look at Philly, if he joined with them, who's the primary ball handler between him and Simmons?
Yeah,
because
Simmons can't play off ball.
Well, exactly. That's why I think we saw like a bit of an adjustment when he first joined with Dwayne Wade in Miami. So that while I can see certain people questioning that and how that would fit, I would point to what happened with Miami when he was able to work it out with Dwayne Wade. At the end of the day, talent is always going to win out. And yes, there is something to be said for fit, but LeBron is so versatile that I believe he can make it work anywhere. And also, the thing about Philadelphia, when they've had Simmons and Embiid, you see them go out and get Redick, Ilyasova, Bellinelli, shooters. That's what LeBron James needs, and that's what he thrives with a supporting cast around him because of his penetration ability and his elite facilitating skills. Same thing with Simmons. So you have sort of a blueprint there that could match what he would like to see. And again, as I mentioned, guys would want to play with him no matter where he goes. Could you see Ilyasova, Bellinelli try to take maybe a discount to come back and play with those guys and really make a run at a title? Maybe. Depends on the market And, Redick's obviously an X factor as well. But I think you certainly have a fair shot at it when you add a guy like LeBron if you're a Philadelphia 76ers fan.
Yeah, and if you tell shooters, hey, you're going to have a chance to play alongside Simmons and LeBron and come here and get valuable playing time, you're going to be an important piece on what could be a contender, a championship contender, they're going to be interested. You're going to find some guys willing to go there. So it is really interesting. I'm surprised they're not being mentioned more as well. When you look at the Lakers, what do they have to do to get a guy like LeBron? Is it landing a guy like Paul George? Is it making a trade for, another piece, or is this core enough to do it? The one thing with LeBron in LA, everyone's bringing up his off-court endeavors, like, his production company and all that stuff, but he's shown he can run this from Cleveland. He doesn't necessarily need to be in LA to have that kind of success. I think once you get to a certain point, you almost don't need to be in a big market because you sort of transcend that. And maybe I'm wrong, but we saw that with Kevin Durant. He had the most endorsements of any player in Oklahoma City. He left more for basketball reasons than for endorsement reasons. LeBron's become, a huge marketing and icon and businessman, entrepreneur. Do you think he would go to LA for the off-court stuff, or is he mainly focused on just on-court fit?
I think for LeBron, it's the total package. Look, sure, the off-court stuff helps. At the same time, you've seen Russell Westbrook market himself nicely in Oklahoma City, which is considered more of a smaller market. LeBron is, as you mentioned, he's the face of the league. He can go anywhere and be marketable.
Right.
I don't think that that's the main thing. It's more about keeping his family happy and, trying to continue to compete for titles long term. He's more than anything a competitor, and he knows he's continuing to, chase the battle of, who's the best player ever. I think that has to creep in his mind at some point on which team can position him to win the most titles going forward, as he advances, as he advances in age.
So if you had to predict Lakers, Cavs, Sixers, where would you have him going?
I'm not a fan of these.
I'm sorry, buddy. I'm sorry.
Because these trade, people say, oh, well, you predicted this, da, da, da. I would say, I think ultimately the Lakers would be, if he leaves Cleveland, the Lakers would be the favorite with strong consideration for Philadelphia. But it's going to be fun. And I think, I think it could be maybe a week or so, maybe a little bit more of him deciding it. It is a big decision. If he decides earlier than that, then I think you can imply that maybe he did his thinking beforehand and kind of had his idea set in stone. But, it's really going to be fascinating. This is going to shape the league going forward, and then what type of deal does he do wherever he signs as well?
That was my next question for you. So I tend to agree with you. I think he should go to Philly. I think he does go to the Los Angeles Lakers. Is it possible, because this is a dry market, as we said, because he doesn't really fully know what he's getting into with this new organization if he does leave Cleveland, let's say, or because he's always been someone that wants to have a 1-year deal to wield that power, to be able to say, you need to build a win now team. If I want someone traded or I want a certain move made, I feel like it's going to happen because I could leave this summer. He's someone that's wanted that power for a while now, even if it's just in the form of, a 2-year deal with a player option for the second year. Do you see him doing that again?
Yeah, I could see that, just because, LeBron doesn't need to sign a long-term deal anywhere. He's LeBron James. If like you said, he holds that power no matter where he goes. I think he loses leverage if he's locked into a contract longer than a 1+1. So if he signed for anything more than that, it would mildly surprise me. But again, you see what's on the table at the time. Anything can happen, but as of today, before we enter free agency, I would think that he's going 1+1 if he can, to continue to hold that leverage over whichever team he goes to, or if he remains in Cleveland.
Now, just one or two more things. When we look at contenders around the league, when you look at the Kyrie Irving situation with Boston, do you think that's an issue right now? I know some fans are getting worried. There's been some talk that the Knicks could get him. I don't know if that's just speculation or if his camp wants him in New York. There have been talk about that before. He's from New Jersey. Do you think Boston has anything to worry about, or are they in a good position to keep him?
Winning cures all.
Right.
So,
exactly.
I mean, I think, I guess you could say in Kyrie's case that he made, multiple finals with Cleveland and he still wanted out. But if Kyrie Irving's the guy in Boston and, Jason Tatum is a rising star and Hayward is there, and Al Horford is an all-star, but it is Kyrie Irving's team. So I think as long as they win and do what they're supposed to do, I still think that they're in a really good position. And, sure, you hear about the rumblings about the Knicks and whatnot, but, you could say the same thing for Kemba Walker, who's going to be a free agent and has some New York ties. So, sometimes I think that stuff gets a little too blown out of proportion. And then, like I said, if the Boston Celtics win and Kyrie's the guy in Boston, they have a young core there. You have a chance at sustainable success. I don't really see why you would leave that if you're happy off the court.
I agree with you, and I think a lot of this started whenever Kyrie was saying he didn't need to sign an extension, it didn't make business sense, and he's right. For fans that don't know, the way the CBA is now, it doesn't make sense for a player to sign an extension. You almost have to hit free agency and then re-sign. You could do what Kevin Durant and Chris Paul, did and say, I'm going to be back here. There's no sense in even talking about it, and that does seem to put the rumors to bed, but I think Kyrie, it all started after he made those comments, and I think those people kind of taking that and running with it and blowing it out of proportion, like you said. Now, just really quickly, Houston and Golden State, two other contenders that were phenomenal this year. Let's start with Houston. Trevor Ariza is a free agent. Clint Capella is a free agent. Do you think they just re-sign their guys and, pay whatever is necessary to do that? Or could you see one of those guys possibly leaving if there's a big enough offer elsewhere?
Personally, I'd bring him back because what has changed Houston and made them a true contender against Golden State is the defensive side of the ball. They've always had the offense, but when you have Capella, Ariza, Luke Mbah-a-Moute, and PJ Tucker, those are guys that can lock up people. And you need that when you're going up against Golden State. If it was up to me and I was running the team, I'd bring them all back and try to go at it again. Because like I said, in my opinion, they were one Chris Paul injury away from having a realistic shot at beating the Golden State Warriors. And, you can't dismiss that because Golden State has been so far and away, the best team ever since Kevin Durant came. And the fact that you were really the first team to give them more than a puncher's chance,
yeah,
I think you have to bring it back. And is it going to cost? Sure. But you know what? You got to pay to get. That's just how it works. Good things cost money.
Yeah, and I think ownership and Daryl Morey, they understand that. They were so close. I think they could have really won that Game 7 if Chris Paul comes back. I agree with you. And this team, you almost took down one of the best teams we've seen on paper. I mean, that, like you said, that has to count for something. Now, last question. Let's talk about that Warriors team. We've heard rumblings that Draymond Green may want a Supermax contract, that Klay Thompson, could look at his options in free agency. Every other team in the league is rooting for this, obviously. We know that they want to see the end of this super team. How does this Warriors team eventually break up? If you had to predict, do you think Draymond or Klay Thompson go elsewhere? Does it end just with these guys declining on their own or having an injury? Well, obviously that's much harder to predict, but that would indicate that they all did return and, Father Time kind of beat them. How do you think this dynasty comes to an end?
Honestly, as of right now, they can only beat themselves if they had some type of, pettiness within the locker room. But I don't see that. As much as you see Draymond Green sometimes being vocal with Kevin Durant and and whatnot. For example, Klay Thompson, he's clearly been happy with his role. He still gets plenty of shots, and you've seen him after finals talking about how happy he is. So could he maybe go somewhere else and be kind of the guy? Yeah, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that's been the saying for a long time. And I think if you're Golden State, pay the guys. Just pay the guys. It's going to cost. Deal with it. It's worth it. You get the championships, and this is a dynasty that you can't take for granted. A lot of people thought way back when Oklahoma City had Kevin Durant, Russell Westbrook, and James Harden, it could last for a decade. Didn't work that way. If you're Golden State, you pay whatever luxury tax you need to, and you keep everybody happy.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think you want Father Time to be the reason this thing breaks up, that, the guys re-signed and, you had all the right pieces, and then eventually guys just gradually decline on their own. I think that's the best case scenario for the Warriors, obviously. We'll see if Draymond and Klay decide to, go that route. But I think that they have to do that. I agree with you. Ownership has to bring these guys back and give them what they want. But the luxury tax, man, that repeater luxury tax is brutal. So we shall see. But thank you so much.
I'll say this though, it's not as brutal as when they struggled back in the day with, the likes of Adonal Foyle and whatnot.
It's a good problem to have.
Exactly. I think they'll be able to pay that bill as they get the revenue from, advancing in the playoffs and winning those titles.
Yeah. And it does make the franchise worth a ton more if you've had a dynasty and, one of the best teams of all time. So I agree with you. Thank you so much for joining me today. He's Michael Scotto. Make sure you guys follow him on Twitter at Mike A. Scotto. Thanks for breaking down the trade market, free agency. I really appreciate it, buddy.
My pleasure, Alex. Always a pleasure, and I'll see you in Vegas, my man.
Definitely. Make sure you guys read his work on The Athletic, too. He does a fantastic job over there. And if you want to listen to new episodes of the HoopsHype Podcast, be sure to subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, Audio Boom, YouTube, HoopsHype, anywhere your favorite podcast can be found. We are there. And until next time, thanks for listening.